So, as schools across the United States continue to contend with the choice of whether to have police in schools, we need to consider the evidence as to whether officers are effective at actually improving school safety and decreasing crime. Proponents of school resource officers cite the benefits of officers in school beyond law enforcement, like the mentoring, relationship building, and teaching students that not all police are bad. Some of the best evidence on perceptions, however, show confusions between school administrators and school resource officers in regarding who's responsible for discipline. So while most school resource officers, they explicitly state that they are not responsible for discipline, how they describe their roles as mentors and educators was commonly explained through this lens of crime control. So in other words, even though activities relating to teaching or mentoring may not appear on the surface to be related to law enforcement, how officers described a typical day was rooted in efforts that could eventually assist officers enforcing the law in the future. So, what does the research say about the effectiveness of school resource officers on crime? The primary objective of school resource officers is to maintain school safety by reducing violence, delinquency, and school disorder. And although SROs may be present to protect students from outsiders, SROs are also policing students themselves. If school resource officers made schools safer, then the evidence should show significant decreases in school-based crime, as well as reductions in other indicators of behavioral problems. Yet the strongest evidence since 2010 suggests, unfortunately, minimal benefits and even more detrimental outcomes. So first, I wanted to look at the effects on school crime in regards to the documentation of reports from school administrators on the number of crimes recorded in schools each year. And longitudinal studies and studies matching schools with and without school resource officers on a number of factors known to be related to delinquency have consistently found evidence that the presence of school resource officers was actually related to increased documentation for drug crimes, crimes involving weapons, and serious violent crimes. So in other words, the schools that have school resource officer are likely to report much higher rates of crimes for drugs, weapons, and serious violent crimes. Whether or not that actually has an effect on responses to crime, unfortunately, studies have found that schools with school resource officers have much harder responses to student crime and disorder compared to schools that did not have school resource officers. And administrators of schools with school resource officers were also found to be much more likely to refer students to law enforcement for a number of offenses compared to schools without school resource officers. Other studies have found that the more schools used their police, the more likely schools were to remove, transfer, suspend, and even refer to law enforcement for non-serious violent crime. And among studies examining how school resource officers identify their role, not surprisingly, officers who identified primarily with the law enforcement role were found to actually record more crimes than schools that did not have school resource officers. So, according to the most rigorous evidence available on the effectiveness of school resource officers, increases in officers in schools was directly associated with immediate increases in recorded offenses for weapon and drugs. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that the presence of school resource officers negatively impacts students' behaviors, but rather that the mere presence of officers in schools may increase the likelihood that such behaviors that are already occurring are now actually being formally documented. And interviews with school staff regarding this issue have corroborated this idea of increased vigilance on the part of school resource officer, with teachers saying, since they see things in a different light than, me as a teacher in the classroom, it's likely that they are much more likely to pick up on delinquent behavior than someone that is not trained to do so. And although true, this goes back to the arguments about the training and culture of law enforcement, where even minor disruptions or offenses are interpreted through the lens of crime control. And additionally, these findings also suggest that increasing officers in school increase the number of suspensions and expulsions and disciplinary issues. So long story short, in sum, the most rigorous findings show increases in school disciplinary offenses in schools with school resource officers is likely due to, increased surveillance and vigilance. And while beneficial from the perspective of administrators and law enforcement in terms of, we're finding more drugs, we're finding more weapons, this is important to keep our schools safe. But at the same time, we're also talking about regulating the conduct of children, which makes it hard to not view the presence of school resource officers in schools as contributing to the school to prison pipeline by increasing these formal responses to behaviors that would otherwise been undetected or traditionally handled informally. And so while the National Association of School Resource Officers argues that school resource officers do not contribute to the school to prison pipeline, the best research available suggests otherwise. It shows that schools with school resource officers report higher rates of exclusionary practices like expulsion and suspension, which we know does not curb future bad behavior. In fact, these exclusionary practices actually make it significantly worse for students to succeed academically and increases the likelihood that youth become involved with the justice system due to the higher rates of referrals of youth to law enforcement. But on the other hand, don't we want schools to be safe? And if so, aren't increases in reported crime and removing problematic students beneficial? And this is a valid argument. But in a recent 2021 study, increases in offensives and exclusionary actions continued long after cohorts of students filtered through. So even when they implemented school resource officers, there should have been a period of time where officers were able to implement their policies and practices and weed out all the problematic schools. But we continue to see very high rates of documentation and exclusionary practice even after cohorts of students have gone all the way through high school. So it's difficult to argue that schools are actually becoming safer when recorded crimes and exclusionary responses persist for so long after school resource officers were implemented in schools. And it's tough because, rooting out students with behaviors that disrupt order and impact school safety may be conducive to improving the learning environment, but unnecessarily harsh responses to behaviors that could, in all honesty, be handled informally and through trauma-informed practices, the more punitive and exclusionary the practices, the more potential to harm students and increase their chances of involvement in the juvenile and adult legal systems. And experts have agreed that police, should be assigned on a regular basis, but only to those schools that are clearly in need of a formal law enforcement intervention, such as schools experiencing extreme high levels of violence. But these are not the most schools, and the majority of schools in the United States can reap the benefits that police can offer by having a school resource officer attached to the school and ready to respond in times of need. But the experts argue that even though school resource officers can be good to be attached to the school, they don't need to be stationed at the school on a regular basis. At the same time, there remains several unanswered questions that are in need of additional research. And while we continue to grapple with school shootings and responding to school crime with strategies that do not work, we should value the work of police, but question whether their presence in schools truly benefit the safety and well-being of students. So in sum, proponents of having police officers in schools argue that their presence is necessary to ensure school safety. And, having an officer working in the schools ensures that there's a quick response to dangerous situations. And by building rapport with students, youth may develop better and different perceptions of the police and may feel more comfortable reporting crimes to the school resource officer. And studies have also shown that officers have the opportunity to gather intel on ongoing crimes through building relationships with students. And finally, advocates for school resource officers suggest that officers can help school administrators determine when behaviors cross the threshold of criminal liability. Nevertheless, despite decreases in offending and arrests among juveniles, the proponents argue that school resource officers are effective and do not contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline. But when we actually look at the evidence, however, that argument is relatively unconvincing. Mostly because having school resource officers in schools seems to have many more negative consequences than benefits. First, schools are relatively safe places, and rates of school crime have been declining long before the regularity of school resource officer programs. And even though we started implementing school resource officers in the early 2000s, why do we still continue to have higher rates of victimization occurring on school than off school? And some of the best evidence suggests that schools with school resource officers have harsher responses to minor offenses that disproportionately affect minority youth. And so while more research is obviously needed to truly unpack how responsible school resource officers are for these findings, We also need to explore how administrators and teachers are handling conflict within their schools and property. It's not always the officers that are responsible for the types of behaviors, but when there is not adequate boundaries and control by administrators and teachers, or even being trained on trauma-informed practices, and instead of getting into these, power fights with a student, understanding where a student's coming from, understanding that the students that are likely the ones that are creating a lot of disruptions are generally the ones that have those higher ACE scores, who are in need of services and trauma-informed resources versus incarceration and labels.